So I'm Jeff Levine. I'm the head of marketing and communications at the Whitney Museum of American Art. I've been in this position for about 8 years, so I really had a chance to get to know the Whitney before it went through this transformation I'm about to talk to you about. Just out of curiosity, before I launch into things, how many of you, just by a show of hands, are currently working at a museum that has been through, is going through, or is considering any kind of large building project, expansion, restoration, renovation? So keep your hands up. How many of you, previous to the job you have now, were in the same situation, have dealt with this kind of, just raise your hand if you've dealt with this kind of situation before. So, you know, if you're one of the few people that didn't raise your hands, chances are if you stay in this field, at some point you're going to deal with an organization that is about to go through a tremendous amount of change due to changing its infrastructure in some way. So I wanted to give you just 2 minutes of background about the Whitney itself, because I've met lots of people so far at the conference who have heard of the Whitney, but I've been surprised at how many people have never heard of the Whitney in a way that fits exactly into my talk. So for those of you who don't know, since 1930, the Whitney has been devoted to the most innovative art of the United States, and has amassed the world's greatest collection of modern and contemporary American art. Earlier this spring, in May, we took the unusual step of opening a new building, which doubled our exhibition space and relocated the museum from uptown Manhattan to downtown Manhattan, and as you can imagine, transformed the museum in a very dramatic way. So my talk today is going to focus on the marketing and communication efforts behind the move. I'm not really going to talk about the reasons for the move, because that really would require a conference in and of itself. So while these thoughts are specific to the Whitney, I hope you're going to find enough information about institutional identity and about how you can communicate complex messages to the public, no matter what your project is. So expansion projects are exciting. They come with multi-million-dollar budgets. They will elevate the exposure of your museum to a level you've never seen before, and you get the chance to work with renowned architects like the one for our new building, Renzo Piano. But the stories we tell about museums tend to be almost exclusively about the architecture and not the art. Our approach at the Whitney was different. Forward. So the Whitney is an idea. The Whitney is not a building, it's an idea. This actually was said by the granddaughter of the museum's founder, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, when she was asked about the idea of constructing a new building. What she meant is that buildings have never defined the Whitney. They've been used to serve the art and the program, and when the Whitney has reached a point where the building has severely limited its ability to do its program and to show exhibitions in the way it wanted to, it really has outlived its purpose. In fact, the Whitney, and this is probably astounding, has had 4 different locations in its short 85-year history. So if you take a look at this map down at the bottom here, where it says 1931, that's where the museum was founded in Greenwich Village. It was originally just housed in some townhouses that Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney owned. And then in 1954, it moved to Midtown, actually on the same square block as the Museum of Modern Art, thinking that it would put it in the mix of everything. After about 10 years, they decided literally being in the shadow of MoMA was not the best thing for the Whitney. And for the first time in 1966, the Whitney constructed a standalone building on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, where it remained for close to 50 years. And I would say for the last 15, 20 years of that time, the Whitney was engaged in multiple attempts to expand on its site uptown. It went through 4 architects, anyone from Michael Graves to Rem Koolhaus, and ultimately Renzo Piano himself was engaged to try to think of a way to expand onto the current museum. But what was resulting was very small, vertically stacked galleries. And the museum actually, this was before I arrived, the museum was ready to do an expansion on its site on the Upper East Side. And instead, the city of New York came to us, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with the High Line, which is an elevated park along the west side of Manhattan, just around 14th Street. they were working on this project called the High Line, which was going to open in 2008. And what they wanted were cultural anchors at the southern and the northern end of the High Line. So another museum had been approached about building a site at the southern end of the High Line at the star at the bottom there. And for reasons I won't go into, that fell through. So the city came to the Whitney and said, just before you build uptown, take a look at this site. And you know, I think it kind of changed everything. The Whitney saw the opportunity that would present itself in terms of having a completely new space, and also the kind of historical pull of returning downtown relatively close to where we started. In fact, it's about a 10-minute walk from the new building to the original Whitney. There were a slew of other issues to deal with in terms of the old site and the new site, but ultimately the museum decided not to expand uptown and to cast its lot downtown with an entirely new building. One of the more memorable comments I heard from a journalist at that time was when he compared the Whitney to a neurotic New Yorker that moves from apartment to apartment and neighborhood to neighborhood, thinking that the new place will solve all of their problems and help them figure out who they really are. Funny, but there was a bit of truth to that. So I thought maybe he's onto something. What did people think about the Whitney? So we asked them. These are some quotes from interviews these very informal interviews that we conducted with visitors outside of other museums in the city. So if you could read them all, I won't read them to you. But what you can see if you take a quick look is that most people didn't know a lot about the Whitney. And those who knew that the Whitney focused on American art didn't know much about American art itself. They could probably name Warhol. If we were lucky, they could name Edward Hopper, who's a key artist in our collection. So there was very little knowledge about the Whitney itself, and seemingly even less knowledge about the subject matter that we dealt with. So really beyond our core audience of artists and contemporary art lovers, most people didn't have a clue about the Whitney. With over 100 museums in New York City alone, and thousands of cultural options for people to choose from, the Whitney was a blur to most potential visitors. However, this made our marketing and communication goals around the new building quite clear. So here they are, and they're relatively straightforward. First, we wanted to clarify who we are and what differentiates us. And really what that meant is putting American art front and center. And secondly, we wanted to reposition the Whitney to be among the must-visit New York City museums. And what we were really thinking about for all my friends here in the room from New York were the Metropolitan Museum, the Guggenheim, and MoMA, which are by far the most visited art museums in the city. We always felt we had a similar profile in the public's eye, but we weren't seeing the visitation. We were probably seeing a quarter of the visitors that the Guggenheim was getting, and I believe the latest figures from the Metropolitan are above 6 million. So we certainly weren't shooting for that, but we wanted to move, you know, from kind of the biggest of the mid-sized museums in New York to being among that top group. Now, in the midst of all this change, we also wanted to make sure, as Paula mentioned, not to lose the current audience. So a new building is such a substantial change. There were a lot of issues at play for us. And you know, new building or not, we really had to get these goals right for the Whitney to succeed in the long term. And you know, in terms of kind of taking our audience along with us, one of the things we thought about was how the new Whitney would still feel like the Whitney when people walked into those doors in 2015. So now I'm going to take you through some of the highlights of our marketing communications plan. I'm going to focus on 3 major areas: graphic design, press, / social media, and marketing itself. So let's start with identity. These are just a small selection of marketing pieces, for the most part, that we were producing when I arrived at the museum in 2007. The logo that you see here was designed in 2000, so it had been around for a number of years, and actually it was a very strong logo, probably one of the strongest museum logos out there. It was distinctive, it had this muscularity which actually reflected the building we were in at the time itself, and I remember when I met with the designer at one point, he called it the sledgehammer, because you could put it anywhere and it really just, you know, it drew your eye to it. I would say the real negatives that we had with it were it wasn't a system. So if I put my hand over any of those logos, this could be for almost any museum for any of these exhibitions. And secondly, there was a real tie to the building we were about to leave. So we kind of lacked this unity of voice that I felt was really important. And I would say as a whole, it had this sort of dated look. Even though it wasn't that old, it felt like it was of a time that wasn't in tune with the current Whitney. Also, there were some practical concerns that a new building brings with them, such as wayfinding and signage, where if you don't have a very clear system in place, life gets very complicated when you're arguing over every single font and things like that. So I'm going to show you it's like a 20-second video that we used to introduce the new identity about 2 years ago in 2013. And then here are some samples of some of the work we've done since the introduction. So the reason we launched the identity so many years before we opened the new building was very purposeful. One is we were about to go through a tremendous amount of change, and I didn't want to throw a new identity in the midst of our biggest marketing campaign ever. So I really wanted the new identity out with enough time for people to start to understand it, to recognize it, so that when the building opened, there wasn't kind of this confusion of what is this institution and where are they? So we did it, and actually it was very successful. And I'm sure some of you have been through this yourselves. Whenever you introduce anything new, people tend to react viscerally for about 2 weeks, and then they forget all about it. But it's been really helpful to us, and I think the most important thing it's done for the Whitney is introduce this consistency of visual voice, and that when you see any piece that you see up here, you kind of instantly know it's the Whitney, which is sort of your goal with any good communication system. But what I really liked about it was the variability. You could turn the volume up for something like this Jeff Koons ad, or it could actually be relatively quiet for something like a museum guide, or a more serious piece that doesn't need to grab your attention. So I want to move now to press. If I were to summarize our approach to the press and public relations campaign, both leading up to the building and opening the building, it's the phrase you'd see here: marrying art and architecture. Our director, when he talked about how the building design came about, said, as much as it's a building, it's designed from the outside, the Whitney was designed from the inside out as well. And that means that we took one of the great benefits of having a building from the ground up is that you can try to accommodate whatever you want. So the program actually ended up informing what the spaces look like, and hopefully when you make your way to New York soon, you'll see you'll see some photos of the building later, but you can actually see from the shape of the building what certain spaces do. You can tell that that's a gallery, you can tell that that's a performance space, etc. So this kind of integral relationship between the program and the architecture really informed our strategy. So whenever we talked about the architecture, we didn't fall back on just aesthetic descriptions. We talked about what the building does for the art and does for the program. So I'm going to show you a bit how we arrived at that approach. This is a photo of the building site in 2011. The construction project was about 4 years. So kind of put yourself in that time frame. It's a pit. It's a big pile of dirt. But we also had to go through some formal approval processes, and we had to release our renderings and initial drawings of the building. So this is really the first reveal of what the building's going to look like. So we put our drawings out. Within 10 days, this comes out in New York Magazine. So if you can't read it, I'll just read the headline, which says, "An out-of-tune piano. The new downtown Whitney is a monumental lost opportunity." It's a pile of dirt that is already a lost opportunity. The other thing I would say is that for those of you who ever work with Renzo piano, prepare yourself for a lot of bad musical puns. So this got us thinking that maybe the response to the architecture is not going to be necessarily positive. We thought about the 3 or 4 years ahead of us and what might be happening and what we could do to start, not necessarily changing opinions, but knowing that people are going to be seeing this building appear in the New York City skyline and be looking at the outside of this building only for years, made us think about how we could start working with the press in the most productive way. And in speaking with our PR firm, who deals with a lot of museum openings, they, to my surprise, actually informed me that typically, there's 2 major types of reviews that come out with the new building. There's the art reviews, which review the show, the inaugural exhibition, and how the museum feels with art in it. And then the architecture critics, who tend not to focus on the art side of it. They tend to focus on the aesthetics of the building. And for some reason, the architecture critics tend to lead the process. They'll be out with their review sometimes 2 to 3 months ahead of the public building opening. So they kind of set the tone in many ways for the response to a project. While the art critics obviously need to wait until the installation has been hung. So we did something slightly different. We asked the architecture critics, we actually told them they're welcome to come by and see the building as much as they want. But we asked them to hold their final review, the big kind of statement about the building, until they'd had a chance to see the new Whitney with art installed in the galleries. They all were fine with that. We didn't encounter any problems. They all agreed to those kind of embargo terms. But the one thing we obviously realized is that was going to compress our coverage. So instead of having months and months of build-up, there was going to be a lot of big visibility pieces, likely within 10 days of the public opening. So hold that thought for a minute and I'll come back to it. I want to talk about artists now. So we can play, we'll see how good you are at identifying what artists actually look like. These are some of the most prominent American artists in the world. There's everyone from Frank Stella to Barbara Kruger to Christo to about 8 others there. So this is a picture of a hard hat tour that our director and several curators, one of many hard hat tours they gave to artists throughout the process. This was not a marketing or communications idea. This was actually something we heard about after the fact, and then we sent a photographer upstairs to take a picture because we thought it was pretty incredible. And it really goes to, I think, the ethos of the Whitney and its connection to living artists. What it did, though, was actually bring this essential constituency into the building process. I think almost every artist that was invited on one of these tours had said they'd never been brought in so early in the building process. So that was very successful in terms of talking to these key audiences. So this went on for several years, lots of tours, lots of behind the scenes. And while publications will agree to kind of terms of engagement and holding reviews, social media doesn't play by the rules. This is actually a post that came out about 6 weeks before the building opened. So, we're still on pins and needles wondering what the response is going to be to the architecture. And this is by Jerry Saltz. For those of you who don't know, Jerry is one of the most prominent art critics in America, has a tremendous social media following. So he posed this question, sincere question. This is the new Whitney. If you didn't know it was a museum, what would you say it looked like? You can see some of the responses there, but we were pillared. People compared it to a hospital, to a prison, to all these kinds to what else is listed there? Google's new server center. And I think this is really the big challenge we all face in trying to communicate a massive change that only people on the inside can see. So we were just at our end because we were a few weeks away from opening. We knew all the press was going to come out, and we were in some ways just prepared for the worst. And then this happened. So this is, I believe, 10 days before the museum opened. This was when we allowed the first architecture reviews to be published. This is the cover, obviously, of the Sunday New York Times. I think their distribution is still in the millions these days. And it was a rave review. It says, a new Whitney lets the city pour in. Downtown museum fits a shifting New York. within 24 hours, Jerry Saltz, same guy who posted that social media feed, writes this story, the new Whitney, a post-museum, a post-museum museum. You know, a rave beyond anything I'd ever seen. So we were heading into all of our big kind of press events and kind of opening events. So this was a Sunday. I think 2 days or 3 days later, we had our actual come one, come all press opening. So I think the final count, and then we had a spillover day, I think the final count was we had 1,200 journalists show up for the opening of the Whitney. We had social influencers, you know, kind of come through the galleries. It was overwhelming. And I'm just going to take you through what happened for the next couple of days. So building on that Times and New York Magazine, we started getting kind of reviews in the Wall Street Journal. And it just kept building into massive coverage in the art publications and building to stories both locally and internationally, and building into some of the most extensive, clearly in the Whitney's history, the most extensive coverage from print to online to television to whatever you can think about. It was an unbelievable experience to go through. And and just one more thought before I move on here. You know, one thing I think we typically think about as communications professionals are worst case scenarios. We're always prepared for kind of what happens if something goes wrong. We were definitely not prepared for a best case scenario. And we were in this astounding situation of just receiving you know, call after call, request after request from outlets we hadn't even pitched. It moved beyond kind of struggling to get coverage to actually being able to respond to the amount of coverage. So I wish at some point in your careers that all happens to you. So now I'm going to switch to the marketing campaign. This is kind of the last big pillar I'm going to go through. So I don't think I've said much about the Meatpacking District, which is the neighborhood that the Whitney moved to. And the Meatpacking District, for those of you who don't know, is about 20 square blocks on the far west side of Manhattan. It gets its name because it was originally the place where all the meat came to the city to be butchered. Now it's really known as sort of a kind of nightclub, restaurant, retail, very kind of high-end neighborhood that people go out to have fun in. What sort of tempered that is the High Line, the elevated park, which had now been open for 5 years or so and became one of the most popular tourist attractions in the city. So it's this interesting mix of kind of partiers, tourists, and it's a real kind of love it or hate it neighborhood. What we decide, so we thought about, do we embrace this neighborhood, which is a little kind of divisive for our locals, but is sort of beloved by tourists. And what we decided to do was just to embrace it. We were going to be here. We figured one thing we could actually start thinking about was changing perceptions of this district. So for those, you know, so often we're thinking about our institutions sort of insularly. And what we started thinking about was our impact on the surrounding community and, you know, for generations to come, what having the Whitney Museum in the Meatpacking District would be like. So we decided to take on the Meatpacking District as our own. Another important thing we decided about the marketing campaign is that it would not feature images of the building. This wasn't because of any fears of how the building was going to be perceived, but really we knew how much focus was going to be on the building itself in our press campaign, that we wanted to make sure that the art received the attention in the marketing campaign. The other thing is that we wanted it to have a clear message. You know, going back to those initial goals I reviewed before. Who are we? Where are we going? So I'm going to just show you some samples of what we did. We actually started, before the main campaign started, we had a couple months of teasers with this phrase, unpacking in the meatpacking. This is a billboard between the High Line, which you can see a bit of here, and 10th Avenue, passed by millions of people every day. So we took one of the most iconic works in the collection. This is Edward Hopper's Early Sunday Morning. We blew it up to about 40 feet across, made this ridiculous looking bubble wrap on top of it, and just set this out for 2 months to let people get a sense of what was coming. So everything we did kind of in March was really focused on the local community. Everything else I'm going to show you now happened within probably 2 weeks of opening and beyond. So this is an image, one of the primary images we use for the main marketing campaign. You know, essentially the thinking here is we wanted to take an iconic artwork from the collection and place it seamlessly within an iconic setting in our new neighborhood, the Meatpacking District. So here you can see the same Hopper painting blending in pretty amazingly with these row houses and the kind of characteristic cobblestone streets of the Meatpacking District. We're stuck. There we go. And we ended up doing, I think, 6 or 7 variations on this, everything from Roy Lichtenstein there on the left to George Tooker with this great subway scene, Cindy Sherman, and one of our favorites, the woman on the right is Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney in a painting by Robert Henry, who's lounging at the top of this very well-known club on top of the Standard Hotel, which overlooks the new building site. So the campaign was everywhere, and it was definitely our largest buy, but we also got a lot of support. That top middle image of Times Square was donated space. So, you know, kind of like what Paula was saying, it's amazing when even money isn't a limitation, where you can go and approach partners. Just the fact of working with the Whitney at this time was really appealing to a lot of people. And we sort of blanketed the city with a lot of outdoor advertising. We worked with some incredible corporate partnerships, and you know, this, I think almost in every case here, this was not just a donation of marketing value, but there were cash donations that came along with this. So these are organizations that really wanted to partner with the Whitney. So very well-known retailers like Macy's, who sponsored the opening weekend, Bloomingdale's, and these actually are in the same corporate family, and they never actually worked together. This was the first time they did a joint project. They did these incredible bags featuring artwork from the collection. Max Mara worked with Renzo Piano to design a handbag inspired by the building itself, and up on the top right is some of the work that Bank of America did for us, and they did everything from kind of low-level things like statement stuffers to ATM messages to this great billboard. So as kind of like a last look, I wanted to highlight 4 or 5 specific efforts that we did that were really our favorites to kind of give you a better sense of the campaign and also hopefully give you some advice for whatever type of project you're working on. Oh, sorry, one more thing. So social media. This was in the wrong place, I think. We had a huge social media campaign, which I'm not going to get into, but I did want to share a couple of elements. We really pushed this phrase, this hashtag New Whitney. And one thing that happened was, you know, so much of our work had been this organic, things we were doing and pushing out, and really for the first time, and I think partly because we opened up photography to visitors in the entire building, things just started to happen. Up in the top right is National Geographic, which has millions and millions of followers, unbeknown to us, hired an aerial photographer and shot the Whitney and put it on their feed, and you know, I think there's like 200,000 likes on that. And then, you know, celebrities, which are always fun, everyone from Lena Dunham in the bottom to Jerry Seinfeld laughing up at one of our outdoor installations. And this was just recently. Katy Perry came through with her friends during regular museum hours and fell in love with this Charles Ray sculpture. So let's move to some of these specific examples. So think small. I think as marketers, we sort of fall in love with these big projects, and of course you need the big projects, but in some ways, sometimes the really small, simple ideas can have a similar kind of impact. So this was one little thing we did when we closed the building uptown. We had the Jeff Koons retrospective, which has since kind of toured the world, but it was a massively popular show, and for the last weekend, we stayed open for, I think, 3 days straight. So we printed up these postcards, you can see a couple here, and we just handed them out to people in the lobby, and we asked them to write in one thing they were excited to do when the new museum opened, and then to address it to themselves, to write their name, their address, and give it back to us. And they forgot about it. This was in October of 2014. 6 months later, about a month before we opened, we mailed about 5,000 of these cards out, and it was sort of this very simple idea that people loved. Secondly, think deep. So as much press as we got, we knew that every story we wanted to tell wasn't going to be told, and we initiated this short web series called Whitney Stories, which ended up being 12 videos, each focused on a different staff member or member of the project team that was involved in an interesting part of the building that maybe people wouldn't hear about otherwise or wouldn't hear them in an unfiltered way. So we did these, and we did them over the course of about 2.5 years, released them maybe every other month or so, and each one told a different facet of the new building story. And they became very popular, I would say mostly on social media, so we would put them into our our Facebook feed, and they totaled, I think, over 1 million views by the time the building opened. Think personal. This is actually very, very special to me. This is a photo of children of Whitney staff members. My son's up there, back on the left there. And the first people we allowed into the building, the first event we had was called a Friends and Family event. This was before donors, before any kind of gala, before any press. And our PR firm thought I was nuts to do this. But we really wanted to let the Whitney family share the joy of this building first. And it actually ended up being a great buzz builder in addition to making people feel really special. That's our director, Adam Weinberg, sitting down below. Think big. Okay, so here are the big ideas. So I'm just going to share 2 with you. So when the building, the Uptown building opened in 1966, Jackie Kennedy was there to cut the ribbon. So we thought, wouldn't it be great if Michelle Obama, First Lady, came to do the ribbon cutting for the new Whitney, and she accepted. So that was incredible in its own right, and I think made for a very special and emotional part of this kind of build-up. We still haven't opened to the public yet. This was, I think, the day or 2 before it. So obviously, when you get any head of state to be involved, especially one who's as charismatic as our First Lady is, it kind of sends you into the stratosphere of something you could never do just on your own. So finally, all along we wanted to do something called a spectacular, some kind of, call it a stunt, what have you, something that would reach people who really were not culture people, were not engaged in the story about the Whitney, something that would somehow reach as many New Yorkers as possible. So we kind of looked around and tried to think, do we do fireworks? We're on the river, maybe we do something on the river. And then one day, we sort of we contacted the Empire State Building because they do these ceremonial lighting. So, we thought maybe they'll make the lights red, white, and blue for the Whitney. And what quickly began as just kind of are you interested in doing something special became something beyond our dreams. What they ended up doing was an 8-hour light show on the night of our opening that celebrated the Whitney's collection by interpreting 12 works from the collection in the lights of the Empire State Building. So kind of imagine yourself in New York City, and over the course of 8 hours, this is happening. I'm going to close now. I just want to say one final word about the Whitney staff and how they approached the building. And I hope this is the first time I've actually said I within this presentation, because selflessness was really, I think, the key approach that everyone had internally and the building project and everyone who worked on this. Early on in our planning, our chief operating officer read this saying to us, which you may have heard before, that it's amazing what you can accomplish if you do not care who gets the credit. So new buildings are complex. They require thousands and thousands of decisions over many years. Of all the decisions we made, I think the one that was most important was this one, to really approach this as a united front. So as leaders in our organizations, we set the tone. And sometimes putting your own ego aside can be the most inspiring leadership of all. Thank you.